Yes, welcome in. We are back. A little bit unexpected, but per usual, as soon as we get done with shows, news breaks, and that's what happened when we did our show on Tuesday, I believe Tuesday night or Tuesday afternoon. News breaks that Max Stienecker, Wisconsin's general manager, is taking a job with USC's recruiting department, reconnecting with a guy that was, I believe, at Cincinnati at one point. And so Wisconsin loses one of its best, and brightest. It was a guy who was 30 under 30, named to a bunch of those type of lists. A really, really energetic guy. I know you wrote a story about it. We'll talk about him. And then we'll also get into the reason we're truly, truly here. And that is Nyzier Fourqurean getting an injunction that was going to, or is going to allow him at this point to have another year of eligibility for Wisconsin. That came down on Thursday night, the judge ruling just on that injunction. We'll get into all of it and try and decipher it, but really not even decipher it, but kind of, talk about what it means for Wisconsin defensively, assuming the case is not heard before the season, which, who knows? Maybe it will be. But before we do that, as always, Home Field Apparel is the official apparel sponsor of the camp. They have the best vintage gear in the game. Check them out, homefieldapparel.com, and use the promo code Bucky24 for 15% off your first purchase. I have seen now in person the new jerseys, or I should say new sweatshirts that they put out, these hockey sweatshirts that they put out, and it's even better in person. So go check it out, homefieldapparel.com. All right, let's jump into this. News came down Thursday night. We talked about it on the show the other day, the hearing and everything like that, and the judge because he asked for a quick judgment here, because February 7th was the date that you have to declare or not declare for or pull your name out of the hat for the NFL draft. And on Thursday night, it came back that Nyzier Fourqurean is getting another year. Jesse, why is the judge issuing this injunction?
Well, I said on our last show that I was dubious of this, but my rationale was just because you played Division II doesn't mean, in my mind, those years shouldn't count for Division I when it fell under the NCAA umbrella, which was different from the Diego Pavia situation since he was at junior college. And what's interesting about this ruling is that the judge didn't say that if you play Division II, it shouldn't count. Basically, what he's talking about is this is a unique case that is specific to Nyzier Fourqurean because of his 2021 season. That's really what this stems from, and it's why Wisconsin and Fourqurean initially filed a waiver to try to get the NCAA to grant him an extra year of eligibility, and the NCAA denied that. The argument at the time was this year should not count because I played a total of 155 snaps that year. Yes, it was over 11 games, but in the argument, Matt Mitchell said, who was then the head coach there and is obviously now the outside linebackers coach for the Badgers, that was the equivalent of 3 games. And he was only playing because of injury. And obviously he had the family situation where his dad passed away the previous summer. So he didn't get a full training session. And Division II is different from D1 because obviously in FBS, you can play up to 4 games and still get a red shirt. And that's not how it works there. And so because of that specificity and the fact that the judge felt like the NCAA was too arbitrary in how it made these decisions to grant people another year, that is part of why Nyzier is had this injunction granted. And it's also, he played 4 seasons in 4 years. So this is a 5th season for him. There's the NIL component as well, which we know Nyzier testified earlier this week. And when he was talking about his NIL money, he said in 2023, he made $5,000 in NIL money at Wisconsin. And last year he made $45,000 and said he stood to make hundreds of thousands of dollars this year, which is also in that case when you can read the details of it. And that obviously a big component, because when I talked to Nyzier last week, he said in D2 didn't make any money. So now you have this opportunity to profit off your name, image, likeness. And it's certainly a big deal for him and for Wisconsin. But this is yet another landmark situation, even if it is only unique to Nyzier and isn't like a blanket situation about D2, D3. This is stuff we just didn't think about or see prior to this year.
Right. And again, I think the idea that it is because of those 3, the not having the ability to play 4 games at the lower levels and still not use a year, there's going to be other people that are going to use that and say, and I feel like there's going to be more cases here at all different levels. We saw from the NCAA statement that they obviously don't agree with this, but the statement, at least the bottom of it, kind of read very similar to the Diego Pavia one, where it's just like, congressional help, please. Essentially, I boiled down, please help us, Congress. We know that that's probably not going to happen quickly, but this whole, I mean, do we think they appeal it?
No. I mean, I don't. Well, first of all, it's this entire offseason has taught me that I don't know what the rules are, and there seem to be no rules. But I don't.
Because they did.
I would ask, what are you fighting for here? If you want to continue this process, and does that mean you're going to appeal the Pavia situation? Are you going to appeal?
They are appealing the Pavia situation.
Okay, so then maybe they will.
This
I
one's
just don't
different.
know how they win. I guess I don't know how they win.
I mean, they haven't won anything, right? And that was the whole thing about the Xavier Lucas situation too. Why is Wisconsin and the Big Ten doing that? Well, because it's not the NCAA doing it; it's Wisconsin and the Big Ten doing it. And there was something else that came out just yesterday about that is kind of intertwined with the Xavier situation. I'll save it though until we get done talking about Fourqurean here. This is like the NCAA statement. Essentially, they're arguing eligibility, right? You have 5 years to play 4. He played 4. That is, I think, their stance here on why they don't think he deserves it. And Wisconsin and Nyzier are saying, yeah, but. And this is like, again, they probably could appeal it. We'll see exactly. But it's also like their reasons for granting waivers and when not granting waivers is very murky. There's not a great process, right? Like there's not a great visual of exactly what qualifies and what doesn't.
Right. I don't necessarily disagree with what the NCAA is saying about you played your 4 years. It's just that the door is open for everything now. And it's tough. It is tough because we've seen the waiver process has made no sense over the years of who gets it, who doesn't. This case seems like it's a slam dunk and all of a sudden you have to sit out, but this guy who's gone through something similar gets to play. So I totally understand that, but absolutely there's going to be other people that use a situation like Nyzier's to help themselves in the future. Ultimately, we just need some type of jurisdiction here that is more consistent across the board. But good for Nyzier for Wisconsin for making this happen, for lack of a better way to put it, taking advantage of the situation at hand. And again, they had to seek an injunction, and someone else, a third party, had to rule in their favor. So they fought the law, and I guess they won. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the injunction it doesn't mean it's over, right? Like
No.
This is not. We have not heard. I don't think we've heard the last of this. I don't know if the NCAA appeals or not. They probably will, because if you don't appeal, you're kind of just saying, okay, I guess, and then everybody else kind of has an ability to jump in and take advantage of the situation. But as you said, his situation is unique. But I also like if I were a D2 athlete and I see D1 athletes be able to play 4 games and not use that year, I'm sitting there like, why the hell doesn't this work? And maybe there's a reason for it. I don't know. Not all of them are on scholarship, which is obviously, I'm not talking about D2 kids, but like on down the list, not all of them are on scholarship. But I don't understand why it happens in one and doesn't happen in the other divisions.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that. The thing about the Nyzier situation, though, is like, what happens if something changes down the road? Well, your deadline to declare for the draft was February 7th, so he's just going to be in limbo. And
there's a supplementary draft, I believe, but
I don't know if he have a chance to like work out for teams or talk to any. Like, I don't know. Hopefully, for his sake, this is what ends up happening, and he's able to play another season.
All right, so let's talk about what it means for Wisconsin to get him back. This is a rather big one. I had someone in my mentions saying, I don't know why it's such a big deal. He wasn't any good to begin with. And when you look at Wisconsin's cornerback room, and I think we all have to take everything that we saw with Wisconsin's defense with a little bit of a grain of salt, because they couldn't stop the run, and they couldn't get after the passer. So the statistics passing wise, they look pretty good passing wise, at least, in terms of yards per game, largely because teams were running it down their throat. But I think you look at the ability to play the way that they did, even with not having a pass rush for the most part. There were certainly breakdowns. The Alabama game were breakdowns, and the way that USC was able to throw the ball, and then even Minnesota in the finale, like there were certainly breakdowns. But I think getting him back is huge, considering what their cornerback room looked like. 3 weeks ago, before we knew Ricardo Hallman was coming back, and before this happened, you were looking at some very, very dicey situations at corner, even with the guys that they brought in.
Right. I realize they've added multiple dudes through the transfer portal defensively, including 5 on the D line, and maybe 1 or 2 of those will emerge as a standout. But you could make the case that the 2 guys they got back at corner are the 2 biggest additions that they got defensively, because it's known productivity in that system. You have your 2 starting outside corners back now, with Ricardo Hallman, who's not going to the NFL draft, coming back for a 5th year. And even if statistically last year his numbers weren't what they were 2 years ago, that's because in part of what he did 2 years ago when he had 7 interceptions and teams weren't necessarily throwing in his direction. And Nyzier Fourqurean on the other side made one of the biggest leaps year over year of anybody, which we talked about multiple times because Luke Fickell and Matt Mitchell have addressed it as well. He finished with 51 tackles, 5 pass breakups, and was a really solid player for them. And that's a guy that has 17 career starts at Wisconsin, including all 12 last season. So now you at least have a better sense of what you have on the back end there. And before those 2 guys, bunch of question marks at corner. Now they were able to add 2 transfer portal guys. And this probably, to me, quiets some of the concern about they have to go get another guy through the portal. They weren't able to get a third this window. What's it going to look like in the spring? Doesn't mean they won't still try, but it at least quells some of that. You have those 2. You have De'Yoni Hill, who started 5 games at Miami a year ago, and you have Jameer Latimer, who played a ton of snaps at Jacksonville State. Those are 4 upperclassmen that I would assume will be your top 4, unless you've got guys like Jay Harper, Emilio Agard, young guys that we haven't necessarily seen a ton of in games that have a lot of potential. So it's a really big deal for that defense. And to your point, Zach, if Wisconsin can stop the run better or get more pressure, and you have to think it can't be any worse, then that would help the back end, because then the quarterback is under duress, maybe making reads they shouldn't, and those guys are good enough to take advantage of it.
What did they rank in tackles for loss this past year?
Was it
dead last?
I know it's only been a couple weeks since we discussed it. It was not good, and it was because, the D-line was like it's funny because the D-line probably exceeded what the expectations were to some degree, but that's because the expectations were so low.
You think they exceeded their expectations?
No, they exceeded what my expectations were of them.
You have the lowest expectations ever known. There is not a chance in hell that they met anybody's expectations.
They had a couple games where they were like, okay. And the expectations were extraordinarily low, is what I'm saying. And
I think the concern was extremely, extremely high about whether they were going to hold up, and it was warranted because they did not hold up.
Look, we can all say this in the offseason, but based on what they've added, you would think they would be better. I mean, if you've got 5 guys, presumably a couple of them have the chance to start, and maybe that means a guy like Ben Barton drops down into a reserve and isn't a full-time starter, which means you've upgraded your talent, because that was somebody who started all the games last season and was a critical player, and still probably will be next season. But yeah, I mean, those guys on the back end help you feel a whole lot better about especially what you're able to do with the pass defense.
Yes. The one thing I know for sure about this defense line, it's going to be bigger than it was last year. They made that effort in the offseason, and so it is going to be a bigger unit, and it has to be. And also probably, it has to be, because they just weren't big enough up front last year. They got pushed around and pushed into linebackers, and it just didn't even make any sense. So them stepping up, and then obviously needing more from the outside linebackers in when it comes to getting after the passer. We just didn't see it nearly enough last year, and that will obviously help the defensive backfield. Before we jump into Max Stienecker, the Xavier Lucas thing, or maybe the thing associated with it a little bit, is the report from Yahoo from Ross Dellinger talking about this group of Power 4 ADs and I guess maybe one or two people from the NCAA, but setting up a potential enforcement wing within like a subdivision of the NCAA to deal with this rev share, these revenue and sharing, and how this all plays out in the punishments for people that are either how they're like manipulating that 20 million or whether NIL deals are fair value, like fair market value. And if they're not, they won't be approved. And in terms of the Xavier Lucas situation, they also will have the ability to punish for tampering. And I think that is certainly notable. And I also believe that may be another thing that comes into play here as to why Wisconsin and the Big Ten is doing what they're doing. They know what's coming down the line with what they're trying to do in this enforcement wing. And someone else brought it up too, that Miami, I'm not sure who it was. There was another school that kind of brought Miami into the picture as well in terms of tampering. I don't think tampering is going to be a slap on the wrist anymore that it essentially has become. And that's again, it's going to be tough to police all of it because we know a lot of schools are doing it. I mean, I don't think I'm going over the top here and saying that Wisconsin has obviously tampered with guys before. I mean, that's just, it happens, right? Like 1 minute Tanner Mordecai is going to the NFL draft and the next day he's signing with Wisconsin. So there was obviously some talk there before he had actually entered the transfer portal. But I think this is significant and how you're going to police this new era. And it sounds like it's not going to be an NCAA thing. It's not going to be this big taking forever process of investigations and all that stuff. It's going to be pretty not cut and dried, but a lot more clear. And I'm anxious to see what exactly that looks like.
If this does move forward, it strikes me as a very good thing for where we're headed and what we need to have in terms of enforcement. The NCAA, as we've seen, has basically no jurisdiction over anything. So something needed to be done. And if you put the Power 4 ADs in charge or people in that structure, those are the ones who've got the most vested interest in enforcing these rules, because those are the schools generally impacting the NIL, the rev sharing, where these schools, at least if this moves forward for next year, can pay out up to $20.5 million across all the sports. So I'm very interested to see what happens here. And the tampering thing, we know happens everywhere. I know I've said this on previous shows. I know of multiple Wisconsin players over the last couple of years who have had other schools reach out and offer a ridiculous amount of money to go play for them, whether it was a third party, whether it was directly to the kid or not. Like, this happens everywhere. So like, let's not pretend Miami is the only one. However, that is certainly the most notable because of the way things went down there. And look, if you're going to have these rules in place, somebody has to enforce them. And that certainly is something that's going to be big moving forward.
It absolutely is. And again, this is not something that is finalized by any stretch, but they were in Washington, D.C., I believe, earlier this week. I believe that's from Ross's story, where they got together and over a couple of days. And it was like 2 athletic directors from every Power 4 conference. And it might even been some other conferences as well, but I know with Power 4 for sure, and exactly how it's all going to play out. But if you're looking for more information about it, Ross Dellinger on Twitter, he writes for Yahoo. He has been on top of a lot of this stuff. He's done a fantastic job. And so you should really go check that out. All right, let's move on here. And the news that came out right after we essentially got off with the podcast last week, Max Stienecker, Wisconsin's general manager, moving on and going to USC to join their recruiting department. I think it's of all the losses, coaching and otherwise, in terms of like administration, not players, but everything else, I think he's as big of a loss as they've had. He is certainly, without a doubt, as energetic as anybody, and just seems so locked in. And I know a lot of people were really, really, upset or sad or, disappointed that he moved on because he was such a big Luke Fickell guy. But this is obviously an opportunity that he probably thought he couldn't pass up.
I would agree. I will start by saying this. It's not great for Wisconsin because he was a rising star in this and was instrumental in the Badgers' last 2 recruiting classes being as highly rated as they are, and we'll see whether it all pans out. it's not going to be the end of recruiting nor the recruiting department for Wisconsin. It would be one thing if he was the only guy there. They have other people, and I'm sure if Luke Fickell wants to backfill that position, he'll have a lot of other viable candidates. So, having said that, yeah, it is still a really big deal because of the relationships that he was able to form with these kids. And I'll tell you this, after this news came out, I called one of the guys who's signed in the 2025 class, Sam Ladaju, outside linebacker. He goes to the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey. And he did not know yet. And he just sounded so crushed is a pretty strong word, but he just like couldn't believe it. And he's like, man, I just talked to him last week. And I think that speaks to the relationships that Max was able to form with these guys, because Sam was telling me a lot of people think I picked Wisconsin because I had a teammate at the Lawrenceville School go to Wisconsin, Raphael Dunn, the safety he was signed in the 2024 class. And he's like, no, that's not it. He's like, it was Max. Yes, there were other reasons, but Max is the reason why going to Madison made it feel like home for me. And he said, and he credited Pat Lambert as well. Obviously, both those guys came in together at Wisconsin, but he said Max has a type of energy and enthusiasm that I didn't see and I've never seen from anybody else that recruited me. And I think you and I have certainly dealt with Max and Pat. We can see that, and the approach they have and the enthusiasm that really resonated with recruits. And he was a major part here in building these recruiting classes, and obviously was a general manager here for a very short period of time and is now moving on to USC for a different type of role. But as it relates to Wisconsin, yeah, as far as off-field personnel moves go, this is about as big as it gets for a program like Wisconsin based on where things are right now and what Max was able to do.
All we can do, is based on our relationship with them, and then also their relationship with players. And you talk to players, as you said, they have such glowing things about them. And then you go, and we've had an opportunity to talk to them sometimes when, like during signing day, and we've had them on the show as well. And the person that you see in those interviews is the exact person that he is when the camera's not on. Like, I always remember saying this about Paul Chris. Like, Paul Chris, when the cameras were on, was one person, and then he just had a completely different personality when they weren't. And if fans had seen that personality more often, I think they'd be a lot less critical of that aspect of him. But for Max, like, he's the exact same person on camera as he is off. Just so much energy and so much vigor and so much like excitement about each and every guy that we would ask him about. So yeah, it's obviously I think it's a big loss, but you're right. They have other guys and other people that are here that could move up. It's not just been Max that has been a part of this recruiting department for the last 2 years. Pat is certainly as big of a part as anybody. And then they have a lot of even younger guys, up and coming guys that I think we're going to probably be hearing more and more about as we get to this next staff, whoever ends up taking over that role. And as you said, backfills it a little bit.
Yeah. I don't know when those guys slept, honestly. It's insane, the job responsibilities that they have. And obviously when they came in was right after Luke got hired. What did he do? He said the two most important things were the recruiting department and the strength and conditioning staff. And who immediately came over? It was Max and Pat, and it was Brady Collins. And those guys in the recruiting department immediately got to work. I wrote a story on those two guys a couple of years ago when they first got here. And like the number of hours they were spending in the office was ridiculous because they knew there was a lot of work to do. But they were really the faces of this recruiting department. And certainly Casey Robach played an instrumental role as well. He's now obviously an assistant offensive line coach. But like essentially what they were able to do was help this department function smoothly because they just divided responsibilities evenly. They called themselves, one was general manager of skill positions. That's what Pat's job was. And he was a defensive back way back when at Cincinnati. So he understood that. And Max was general manager of big skill. So he would handle like a lot of the linebacker stuff. And it was kind of like a yin yang relationship that worked very well. And again, it remains to be seen what these recruiting classes are going to look like if and when they do get on the field. But you can't deny the level of effort and work that both those guys put in. And maybe you could say it was only a matter of time before Max moved on. I would have thought, though, that a promotion to general manager might be enough. On the other hand, we don't know what kind of money is involved. But let's be real, USC and what they're trying to build with that recruiting department is something I'm not sure I've seen in this college game. They had Chad Bowden who was at Cincinnati, and then he went to follow Marcus Freeman to Notre Dame and built the Fighting Irish roster. And now he's at USC, and he's hired like 3 director of player personnels, essentially, or GMs, one that he brought from Notre Dame, one that he brought from Illinois, and now Max from Wisconsin. So USC is certainly loading up on that department, and I think it speaks to what you probably have to have at the highest levels of college football. It's essentially a pro personnel department, but I'm pretty sure Wisconsin is going to build it out in a way that is going to allow them to have success from a recruiting standpoint. Not comparing it to USC, but they understand how important this is, and that's why they've continued to add to that department since Luke's been here.
Does it, though, look – is it a tough look for Wisconsin to lose their general manager to a spot? Yeah.
It has to be. It has to be. I mean, again, I don't know what kind of money is involved, but
a lot, probably.
Those conversations. I don't know what the discrepancy was there, but certainly, I mean, you're one of your brightest young off-field personnel people is gone, and that's never a good look.
Yeah. I've seen some talk about the money for sure. And it's a lot, obviously. And it's also LA, though. You have to take that into consideration, like the cost of living and everything like that. No, we won't take that into consideration at all. But here's the thing with Max and losing him and having to, readjust and figure out what's next is just what Wisconsin is going to have to do. And that's certainly something that Luke Fickell will have to do. And I wonder if it is just going to be Pat Lambert. Do you think it would be? They just move him up, or do they fill that spot with somebody else?
It's really hard to know. Like, I don't know what the thought process is inside Luke and the recruiting department is. Do they feel like, Pat has a skill set and he's able to connect with these players too, and he's got a lot of energy and enthusiasm. And if you want a general manager type guy, do you bring in a different type of person who is more removed from the straight up recruiting aspect of it and better understands the financial side? Because that was one thing. We talked to Luke very briefly about Max and what the new structure would look like way back in July at Big Ten Media Days. I went back and found that conversation and included it in my story when he was asked about Max. But he talked about the fact that Max had these ties to these recruits, and it was going to have to be a little bit different when he was transitioning into this new role. And I think because you're dealing with money and budgets, and maybe you have a personal bias because you really like someone and bonded with them. And so I do think that there's a case to be made for bringing in somebody else that can handle the general manager type responsibilities that is less involved with the building of the relationships through that recruiting process, be it high school or the transfer portal.
I get that aspect of it. If we're really just talking about pro personnel, we're talking about what it's going to take. I think you bring in, like, for the Packers have, they have Brian Gutekunst as their GM. They also have a guy who handles all the money and handles the salary cap aspect of it. Wisconsin as a school is going to have to do that because obviously the rev share and that aspect of it. Maybe you do go that way with that position from now on. That was probably not something that Max was necessarily, not that he couldn't handle it. I'm sure he could. But maybe he wanted to get back to if he wanted to get back to it, he could have said, "Hey, Luke, I want to get back to doing this other stuff as opposed to being the GM." But my guess is it's just a huge opportunity that was just too good to pass up, both financially and exposure wise for like what is next in his career. He's still so young that he's got an extremely bright future. We're going to be hearing from Max for quite some time, I think.
Very much so. I mean, how many guys do you hear about that he enrolled early at Cincinnati, not because he was a football player, but because he wanted to help with the football program. And he aspired to be a coach, ended up moving toward the recruiting department, and was so influential and so impressive to a guy like Luke Fickell that he hired him as soon as he graduated in 2021 to be a part of that recruiting department and thought highly enough of him to then bring him here. So no question, he's got a bright future. And in terms of the general manager position, what I think is so interesting is, let's just say hypothetically, this revenue sharing thing goes through and you have $20.5 million. I don't know what the percentage is going to be in terms of which sports are allotted what, but we know football is going to be number one. Let's say you have a $15 million revenue sharing budget. You need somebody who's responsible for handling what the pay breakdown should be and being involved as a tough negotiator, because that's part of this process too. So it's a whole new world in college football. I will say, though, that I don't It is not a great look for Wisconsin, but I don't feel a general sense of panic about what this means for recruiting at Wisconsin, because I know how much Luke Fickell understands the value of it, that I'm sure he'll get the necessary people in place to try and help Wisconsin move forward.
Yeah, I would agree. Anything else you wanted to hit on this thing here?
I think
Do you think they lose anybody because of Max?
In terms of recruits?
Yeah.
No, because the 2025 class is signed. 16 of them enrolled early.
And they can leave whenever they want.
Well, sure, but I think that would largely like if
Can
you're
they?
leaving, well, I would say if you're leaving because a guy who recruited you, who's not even your position coach, isn't here anymore, you're not here for the right reason to begin with. Like maybe you go to spring ball and
you literally said Samuel Leteju chose Wisconsin because of Max.
Well, there was more to that than that conversation. And I was like, you do realize, like, you know, the program is still going to be in place and all that. And like, he understands that. So I think there can be a level of disappointment and maybe even as big of a word as is devastation for some guys. And like Jalen Williams had he put out a post on X with like these broken hearts. You can have good relationships with these guys. I would also say if that's the sole reason you're coming, you're probably not going to be here very long. And I realized that I said what Sam Leteju told me about how influential and important Max was, and that he was more of a reason than like his former teammate. But even for Sam, there were more reasons than that. Matt Mitchell and the relationship he had with him, who's going to be his position coach, he talked about how important that was. And he called Max essentially like the cool older brother figure is kind of how he looked at it. So I think that's the kind of relationship that these recruits had with him, because he's not far from being in their shoes.
Yeah, he's still so young, right? So having graduated in 2021, you said it's 2025. So yeah, definitely still under 30, easily under 30 still. I am not. Nor are you.
It goes fast.
It does. It does. That's all right, though. All right. We will be back next week. And whatever happens next week, we'll talk about it then. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right. There he is. Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Can.